Listen, if you think you have unlimited time to buy XRP at these prices, you're already late because once that switch flips, you're not buying XRP anymore. You're chasing it. And I know the title sounds a little crazy, but stick with me all the way to the end. This is not about hype. This is about positioning. And positioning is what separates the people who get in early from the people who are left asking what happened. So let me set the stage real quick because I really need you locked in for this. I want you to take a look at the Bitcoin ETFs. Picture it on your screen right now. Spot volume, cumulative volume, ETF market share. When you actually zoom out and look at the numbers, it becomes impossible to ignore what's happening. Right now, Bitcoin ETFs are pulling in massive amounts of capital every single day. We're talking 4 billion, 3 billion, 5 billion, 6 billion, then 5 billion again day after day. This is not a one-off event. This is consistent institutional demand. These Bitcoin ETFs are bringing in cash, folks, every single day. That is fresh liquidity entering the market nonstop. Now compare that to what XRP is doing today. XRP is doing around 15 million in daily volume. On strong days, maybe 30 million, 40 million. We've even seen 50 or 60 million occasionally. And look, for retail investors, that sounds like a lot. 30 or 40 million a day feels massive if you're thinking like an individual investor. But for institutions, that is couch change, especially when you compare it to Bitcoin. This is where most people completely miss the bigger picture. Bitcoin didn't go up just because people suddenly liked it more. Bitcoin didn't magically become valuable on its own. Bitcoin went up because BlackRock and Fidelity showed up. That's the difference. When institutions arrive with size, the entire game changes. Now, look at the actual ETF data. Grayscale is there, sure, but that's not who we're focused on. The real story is BlackRock and Fidelity. When you pull up BlackRock's ETF on-chain holdings and volume, the scale is almost unbelievable. In November alone, BlackRock did 8 billion in volume in a single day. Recently, they're consistently ranging between 3 and 6 billion daily. And that's just BlackRock, one firm. This is the cheat code. When BlackRock walks into a room, liquidity explodes. When Fidelity joins them, liquidity goes parabolic. Supply doesn't stand a chance against that level of demand. Now look at XRP. Who do we have right now? Franklin Templeton is involved. And yes, that's a big name in traditional finance, but in crypto terms, it's not BlackRock. Bitwise is probably the biggest XRP ETF issuer we have exposure to right now, and they did around 5 million. Compare that to BlackRock doing 5 billion. Even if you discount it down to 1 billion, the difference is still staggering. This is why price does what price always does when demand outpaces supply. It rips and it rips violently to the upside. So here's the question you need to ask yourself, and I want you to really think about this. Not if, but when. What happens when XRP gets a BlackRock ETF? What happens when XRP gets a Fidelity ETF? Because remember, both BlackRock and Fidelity were present at Ripple Swell. That wasn't random. Institutions don't show up to these events for fun. Look at Fidelity alone. Their Bitcoin ETF is doing anywhere between 400 million and 800 million a day. XRP ETFs right now are doing 15 million, maybe 30 million on a good day. If even one of these giants steps in, the volume profile changes overnight. That's not speculation, that's math. And right now we don't have them. That's the missing piece of the puzzle. This is the window where positioning still matters. To make this even crazier, Morgan Stanley has now launched a Bitcoin ETF. That should tell you everything you need to know about where this market is headed. Institutions are not dipping their toes in anymore. They're diving in head first. And here's where people get emotional instead of logical. They wait for confirmation. They wait for the ETF approval. They wait for the headline. By the time it's on the news, the move is already well underway. You're no longer buying value, you're chasing momentum. That's why early positioning always feels uncomfortable. It feels boring. It feels slow until it isn't. XRP doesn't need retail hype to move. It needs institutional flow. Bitcoin proved that. Ethereum proved that. The moment real size enters the market, price has no choice but to adjust upward. Liquidity drives everything. And when you look at XRP's supply dynamics, utility narrative, and regulatory clarity improving over time, the setup becomes hard to ignore. The only thing missing is the volume catalyst. And that catalyst, historically, has been ETF approval, backed by names that command trillions in assets. So when people say you have plenty of time, ask yourself what they're basing that on. Because the moment that switch flips, the opportunity doesn't disappear quietly. It vanishes in a vertical candle. So let me ask you something very simple. Fifth grade math. You don't need a calculator for this. If XRP is currently doing around 30 million a day in volume and Bitcoin is doing 5 billion a day, what do you think XRP's price would look like if even a fraction of that volume showed up? And that's why the title is what it is. Because once institutional volume hits XRP, you're not going to be casually buying anymore. You're not going to be dollar cost averaging in peace. You're going to be competing. You're going to be competing with institutions, funds, desks, and allocators who don't care about your entry price. They care about access and scale. The crypto market structure bill was delayed, and a lot of people immediately reacted with, wait, isn't regulation good? And yes, good regulation is good. No argument there. But this bill, the one they kept trying to push through, wasn't good regulation. And deep down, most people knew that. Let me explain this in plain English so you understand why this delay actually matters and why Coinbase, Ripple, and others are pushing back the way they are. Banks do not want competition, period, full stop. They see what Ripple is doing. They see what Coinbase, Gemini, Circle, and the broader crypto ecosystem are building. And they don't want that competing with their business model. DeFi competes with banks. Stablecoins compete with banks. Tokenized assets compete with banks. And this isn't speculation. JP Morgan's CFO literally said it out loud. He said, if stablecoins are allowed to offer yield, money will leave the banks. That one sentence should explain everything to you. That's the real fear. Brian Armstrong came out and said it clearly. No bill is better than a bad bill. And he's absolutely right. We get one real shot at this, one chance to put a framework in place that protects innovation instead of suffocating it. And this bill wasn't doing that. When you actually look at what the bill proposed, it becomes obvious who it was designed to protect. It wasn't builders, it wasn't users, it was banks. Tokenized stocks would have been heavily restricted. DeFi protocols would effectively be treated like banks, subject to surveillance requirements that would crush them. The SEC would gain even more power. Innovation would slow to a crawl. Stablecoins wouldn't be allowed to pay yield because banks hate that competition. So what happens in that scenario? Crypto gets boxed in, banks stay safe, innovation gets throttled. Now here's where XRP enters the picture. And this is the part almost no one is talking about. When regulators choke innovation, activity doesn't disappear. It gets funneled. It gets pushed into compliant regulated rails. And Ripple lives there. XRP lives there. Ripple has spent years building within regulatory boundaries, not outside of them. Love it or hate it, that's the reality. And in an environment where regulators tighten the screws, compliant infrastructure doesn't get hurt. It gets rewarded. And that brings us to something that is absolutely massive and completely flying under the radar. Ripple just locked in a multi-year deal to integrate RLUSD across LMAX Group's global marketplace. Let that sink in for a second. You now have Ripple's stablecoin moving through institutional trading pipes, cross-asset global real liquidity. This isn't a pilot. This isn't a test. This is real infrastructure. And every time Ripple expands its usage, XRP becomes more valuable as the bridge. That's the part people still struggle to understand. XRP isn't competing with RLUSD. It benefits from it. The more stable coins, tokenized assets, and institutional flows that move through Ripple's ecosystem, the more demand there is for XRP as a bridge asset. Liquidity begets liquidity. This is why XRP's positioning is so unique. While everyone else is fighting regulatory headwinds, Ripple is operating inside the system, building rails that institutions are comfortable using. And when you combine that with what we talked about earlier, institutional volume, ETFs, and liquidity, you start to see the setup clearly. Bitcoin proved the playbook. Ethereum followed it. Institutional money doesn't trickle in quietly. It floods in once the gates open. Right now, XRP is still in the phase where people argue, debate, and doubt. That's always the phase before the move. Because once the volume shows up, the debate ends. Price becomes the argument. And that's why I keep coming back to this idea of competing versus positioning. You either position before the liquidity arrives or you compete after it does. There is no third option. Most people will wait. They'll wait for the bill to pass. They'll wait for the ETF approval. They'll wait for confirmation. And by the time they feel safe, price will already be far higher. That's how markets work. That's how they've always worked. XRP doesn't need hype cycles. It doesn't need retail mania. It needs institutional adoption and regulatory clarity. And piece by piece, that's exactly what it's getting. So when you hear people say you've got time, ask yourself what they're actually looking at because the data is already telling the story. Volume precedes price. Infrastructure precedes adoption. And once that switch flips, you won't be asking whether to buy XRP. You'll be asking how you let yourself watch it happen without being positioned. This isn't hype. This is plumbing. And plumbing is what decides price. Always has, always will. Narratives come and go. Headlines fade, but plumbing, infrastructure, liquidity rails, that's what actually moves markets. Which brings us to this. The CME Group, the largest derivatives exchange on the planet, is expanding its crypto futures offerings. Cardano, Chainlink, and Stellar are being added. XRP is already there, and anyone who's been paying attention knows exactly what this means. This is how institutions step in before spot ETFs. This is the roadmap. We've seen it every single time. Derivatives come first, futures markets get built, liquidity deepens, price discovery improves. Then and only then do you get spot ETFs. We already have Chainlink spot ETFs. There are two of them. And if I were a betting man, which I am, you're going to see Cardano and Stellar ETFs next. This isn't speculation. This is pattern recognition. This is the pathway. Derivatives first, liquidity second, institutional capital third, price last. By the time retail notices, the move is already well underway. And that brings us to the bigger picture. Bitcoin isn't pumping for no reason. It's pumping because global liquidity is moving. This isn't just crypto specific. This is macro. This is monetary. This is capital rotation. Listen to what Mars's CEO said because he explained it perfectly. When liquidity comes back into the system, scarce assets move first. Bitcoin and Ethereum have already proven this cycle after cycle. In developing countries, Bitcoin acts as a hedge against currency debasement. In developed markets, it's treated as an investment asset, a store of value, something that trades like a hybrid between equities and gold. And what drives all of that? Global liquidity. Interest rates come down. Governments inject liquidity. Capital looks for assets that can absorb it. Bitcoin benefits first. Always has. Always will. But then comes the real question. What comes next? Every cycle, it's the same answer. Assets with real utility. Assets with regulatory clarity. Assets that institutions can actually touch without blowing themselves up. And that's where XRP sits. XRP isn't alone here. You're also talking about Chainlink, Solana, Ethereum, Cardano. But XRP is uniquely positioned because of where it lives in the regulatory and institutional stack. Liquidity doesn't ask for permission. It finds the cleanest path. And right now, the cleanest path is compliance. That brings us to something that hasn't gotten nearly enough attention. Let's talk about Ashura and the XRP Treasury Company. Instead of staring at a black screen, let's put a visual up. They're going public. We knew this was coming. The ticker will be XRPN. It will trade on the NASDAQ. And look at who's backing it. SBI, Ripple, Panta, Kraken, GSR. Yes, that GSR, Ripple's market maker. The same group people love to talk about when they complain about XRP's price action. Funny how that works. This is the largest public XRP treasury company in existence. And what are they doing? They are actively buying XRP from the open market. They are lending it. They are using it for liquidity. They are deploying it in DeFi strategies. Let me say that again slowly so it really sinks in. They are removing XRP from circulation. Between all of these XRP treasury companies, and there are either 8 or 9 of them depending on how you count, massive amounts of XRP are being pulled off exchanges and out of the liquid supply. Add ETFs to that. Add institutional OTC desks to that. And now let's rewind to the beginning of this entire series. What happens when BlackRock and Fidelity step in? What happens when BlackRock is doing $1 billion a day and Fidelity is doing 500 million? What happens when suddenly 1.6 billion a day is buying XRP through over-the-counter desks so it never even touches the open market? What happens then? The answer is simple. Price adjusts violently. Supply shock meets institutional demand. And that's not something you can slowly buy into. That's something you either positioned for or you didn't. It's only a matter of time. It really is. And if you think BlackRock is going to sit this one out, if you think they're going to watch from the sidelines while competitors move in, good luck with that. There is no chance. They smell money. They want in. And they're already working closely with Ripple. So when you zoom out and you connect the dots, institutions, ETFs, derivatives, liquidity expansion, regulatory pressure, treasury accumulation. This isn't noise. This is structure. And when structure locks in, opportunity disappears quietly and then violently. You don't get a warning. You don't get a second chance. You just get price. That's why this entire conversation matters, because most people are still debating narratives while the plumbing is being finalized underneath them. XRP isn't waiting for retail excitement. It doesn't need it. It's being built into the system. And once it's fully embedded, you won't be buying XRP anymore. You'll be watching it. You'll be saying, you wish you understood this earlier. You'll be saying, you wish you paid attention when volume was low and positioning was still possible.